What other places are out there for food safety professionals besides working in the lab or working in a food production facility? Government, industry, third party, even self-employment. As a student or even as a current food safety professional, you might not be aware that there are countless career paths that are available to you.
Something you thought was black and white maybe has shades of gray and need to figure out, well, how do I navigate this? What's the position that I'm going to take? And so
Meet Jennifer McEntire, founder of Food Safety Strategy and former Chief Food Safety and Regulatory Officer at the International Fresh Produce Association. She is a food microbiologist by background and has worked in the Washington, D.C. area for over 20 years. She held previous food safety leadership positions within the Grocery Manufacturers Association and the Institute of Food Technologists, where she led the FDA FSMA traceability pilots. Today, she will unveil the curtain behind what it's like working in food safety policy. So in this episode of the Food Grats podcast, you will learn about Jennifer's food safety career journey. We'll talk about these skills that are important for food safety professionals. We'll also look at some of the safety concerns regarding produce.
So what is that risk? How can I manage that risk? How can I avoid contamination, knowing that someone is going to eat this product, usually raw?
Technology role in the future of food safety, and we'll also talk about making decisions, and so much more. I hope you enjoy this conversation today with my co-host, Anna Koo, Campus Ambassador for the University of Guelph. Let's get into this conversation with Jennifer.
Thank you. Well, I want to give a warm welcome to Dr. Jennifer McEntire. Thank you for being on our podcast. I know you have a wealth of knowledge in the food safety world and also in the world of produce. And you also worked many years in the government industry. So really want to pick your brain as to your experience and just any tips and tricks you want to give to us. So I guess I wanted to be able to get an introduction from you.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for having me. I love talking about my career because I think we all know that there aren't a ton of food scientists, and then there are fewer food safety people, and then there are even fewer people who do the sort of work that I do. So I grew up in Long Island, New York, not exactly the heart of agriculture or food production or anything like that, but I liked science. Wasn't really sure what a scientist did. I didn't want to be a medical doctor, and I got pretty lucky. I think that when I was looking at colleges, the University of Delaware sent me some information, a packet of information, and this is like before internet days, so dating myself a little bit. So it was snail mail and this big packet of, if you like science, maybe you'll like food science, and what the 4 years would look like, and some starting salaries and types of jobs that people had, kind of a reprint from IFT, the Institute of Food Technologists, some newspaper articles about research that was going on in the department. And so I liked that. So I decided, well, the first 2 years are just like basically science anyway, so might as well give it a shot. And I loved it. I really have loved pretty much everything that I've done, although it has been, like I said, a bit of an unusual career. I'm not a laboratory scientist. I did get my Ph.D., so I did do the lab work. I started as an undergrad at Delaware. I visited Rutgers by virtue of being part of the IFT Student Association and met the chair of the department, the professor there. He invited me to come into his lab. I was assured that since I had done undergrad research, that it would be pretty easy to just kind of swing right into graduate school. I can't say I was especially interested in graduate school. I knew I did not want to become a professor. I thought that would be kind of boring. So yeah, I wanted to be a scientist, not a professor. So I was a little lost. I just spent a lot of time talking to people, especially through IFT, going to some of the regional meetings and talking to professionals, talking to other students, and learned about the diversity of career options. But I think what was critical for me was during my doctoral work, I had the opportunity to go to Washington, D.C. for 7 months. So I spent 3.5 months at a trade association, 3.5 months at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, and that was life-changing. That was when I was like, now I see what I want to do. And so since then, I really haven't really left D.C. So that's a little bit about me.
That is so interesting.
One thing that I love about this podcast is that I'm in Toronto, I'm in Canada. So
Yes.
I'm starting to learn a lot more about the different culture in the United States, especially how it looks to food safety, food science. And it's funny that you're opening. I'm still learning so much about this, and I know quite a lot about the roles that are there, but to even dive deeper to learn that there's even more within, policy side Washington, it's so exciting to learn about. So with that being said, can you talk about a little bit how these roles were when you were in Washington? Because that again is something totally new to me. So would you be able to talk about how that worked?
Yeah. So Washington, D.C. is a world in and of itself. Some people love it. Some people really, really do not. That's fine. For me, I loved it. So I started my career. I don't know if you can call an internship the start of your career, but some of the things that stood out to me when I did intern at the trade association, it was an unusual trade association because they had a laboratory, a couple of laboratories. So I worked in the lab, but I knew that the research that I was doing in the lab, that the results were being generated specifically because FDA had proposed a rule. This was juice HACCP, and there were questions as to what should the bounds of the rule be. Like, should juice concentrates be included in juice HACCP, or are the concentrates just by their nature, their pH, titratable acidity, Brix, like, are they just inhospitable environments that you don't have to have a 5 log reduction of a juice concentrate? And like, who thinks about this stuff? And then you go and see, well, there's not a whole lot of research on how microbes survive or don't in juice concentrates. So that was the sort of work that I was doing. From the laboratory technical standpoint, it wasn't particularly complicated work, but to feel like some of this research could influence a rule, policies that will affect everybody in this industry, that was like, wow. And then going over to FDA, I got to touch a little bit of everything. So some of the constituent updates, which are the consumer-facing communications, learning a very different style of writing. So not the peer-reviewed publication scientific writing, but how do you write to like the average consumer? How do you inform pregnant women about the risks of methylmercury in fish and the health benefits of eating fish? How do you talk about listeria to pregnant women? So those were some of the things that I worked on. There were also some outbreaks going on at the time, and seeing how the government collaborated with other governments when they were in other parts of the world, how they collaborated with industry. It was really interesting to me. And so one of the things that I've always loved about every role I've had in Washington, D.C. is that it is this nexus. It is this coming together of many different perspectives, not just the science, but other factors that are used in the decision-making process. And these decisions, they affect far beyond Washington. They affect the country, they affect the world, they affect the trading partners to the United States. And so I really have loved the roles that I've had in Washington. And when I started my full-time job in DC, I actually worked for IFT. So at the time, IFT had a satellite office in Washington, DC, and we did contract work for the Food and Drug Administration. So FDA would kind of own our team a little bit for 5-year blocks of time. And as FDA had questions, problems, things that they wanted experts to opine about, do lit reviews about, they would call us. And this was in the post 9/11 environment at this time. So a lot of the work that I started on was on food defense, which is totally not my food micro background. A lot of it was some of the chemical and not even typical food chemicals. These are like things that you would not expect to be in your food, that should not be in food. So got to touch so many different things. And I like that kind of diversity. I've always loved working with people who are real experts in their fields and pulling them together and just learning so much from them. So that's one of the things that I love about the DC scene.
Wow. That's so, again, as you're speaking, I keep thinking about all these different roles that I don't think about, because a lot of food safety that I focus on and I tell students about is the food safety, the QC techs, the QA techs, which are just as integral for the food safety, as doing consulting work as well. But then thinking that there's also roles for those who aren't necessarily into lab work that are still food safety and being able to get involved with that, especially policy, because I think that, I mean, it's something that affects us every day, but yet I feel like I still have to learn about the individuals doing it. And with that being said, another conversation that you had that had really stood out to me was that you had spoken about representing science in the government. It's always been a really important thing with you. But you had mentioned that surprisingly, science is not always the push that actually makes the decisions. So I wanted to elaborate a little bit more about what you mean by that, and then maybe we can take the conversation from there.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the things I learned very early on in DC, and maybe one of the things that people don't really think about it. When you're, for me at least, being trained as a scientist, you rely on facts and data, and the world is presented as being kind of black and white, right or wrong, like there is truth and there is fiction. And then you get to DC, and then you start to learn about policy and how decisions are made and how the negotiations are made. And so you see that there are other perspectives that maybe in order to be 100% right, it's going to be cost $1 million, but you could be 99% right, and it's only going to cost like $1,000. So then you start to go, well, do I have to be 100%? Like, is it okay to be 99%? Situations are presented that I would never think about. People see things so differently, or they bring their own personal experiences to policy discussions, and you start to question yourself, and sometimes, or at least view the science differently. And sometimes you just realize you need a little more information, that you can't, something you thought was black and white maybe has shades of gray, and need to figure out, well, how do I navigate this? What's the position that I'm going to take? And so it becomes questions of economics, political will. Sometimes people disagree just because they don't want to be seen as being in agreement with someone who they're ordinarily opposed to. Even if the answer is like, oh, it's so obvious that you should all be on the same page, but like, nope, you don't like that other person, you don't like that other group, and so you simply cannot agree with them. It's like that's some of the silliness, that's some of the frustration that happens in DC. But my feeling has always been that going into a policy discussion that's related to food safety, the science has to be on your side. Like you have to feel confident that you are doing what the science says, you're following the science. But it became clear to me early on that if you start talking science with people who are not scientists or don't care about science, you're going to lose credibility pretty quickly. So if you want to be influential, the way you tell your story may not have a whole lot to do with facts and figures and data. That may be off-putting to a lot of people. So the storytelling aspect is really important. That doesn't mean that you can't have the science. You have to have the science to back you up.
So I'm just thinking again with the student audience, because even though we're talking on the policy side, for some reason, this reminds me of when I was doing food safety and I was trying to speak to like plant workers or speaking to different individuals. And that was one of the struggles that I had, was translating that science to, we have to get this product out. Your science isn't helping me. So I guess for those listening, because this might be an experience for the students that are coming in, how would someone practice being able to talk about the science, or just practice ways to communicate differently?
I think start with your own family, especially if your family is not scientists. Friends, neighbors, just like your average person. Can you get your message across? And part of that is starting. For me, I start by thinking, what is the message I'm trying to get across? What is the action I want someone to take? Something I heard recently that resonated with me was to use inductive logic, inductive reasoning, instead of deductive reasoning. So deductive reasoning is, here's all my facts and figures, blah, 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 and therefore, here's what you should do. But if you flip it the other way and say, here's what you should do. You start with the punchline. And then if you need to back into the whys and the facts and the figures, you can, but bring something home to them. Give somebody something to start thinking about themselves and engaging in a conversation. Start with like it's usually the most interesting, kind of the cool piece. What change do you want to make? Why are we doing, why do we have to do this? And then the background can follow if there's time and if people even care, or if even they question you, but get them interested. Don't just have like a word vomit of all your facts and figures and think that that's going to convince somebody to do what you want them to do. So if you practice on your family, that's one type of audience, your friends, maybe people of different ages, different backgrounds, and see what adjustments do you need to make in order to get your point across very succinctly and very quickly, because I think people also don't have a whole lot of patience or attention span.
That makes sense. I can imagine, Anna, that you also have had these experiences throughout your time.
Yes, it seems like food safety is always like the police, that we tell people not to do this, and the risk assessment doesn't always outweigh the money aspect. So I really wanted to like ask Jennifer, I guess, what influencing skills or perspective would you bring forward to say like food safety is key, but there's also other considerations that they can do?
Part of, I think, being influential is spending a lot of time listening. So trying to understand, for someone who doesn't see things your way, why don't they? What's on their mind? What are they concerned about? Are they concerned about the cost of a capital investment? Are they concerned that something is going to decrease the production rate, that they're going to anger their customers? Are there other things that maybe you haven't thought of, other consequences that they're concerned about? So really trying to tease that out of someone else, asking good questions, to me is a key piece of that. And then ultimately, I think as the food safety person, you're right, the food safety person is viewed as the police. I usually say, like, they're never the most popular people in the operation, right? So how can you avoid being viewed as just the person who always says no? How can you try to say yes when you can, but also gain the respect so that when you have to say no, they understand it's a hard no? Some food safety people, I will say, some food safety people just really like having the power to say no. And in the long term, that probably doesn't turn out well. So I think to listen and negotiate and give where you can, so that you can enforce the no when it's necessary. Sometimes you may also just lose that battle. And then I think it's the responsibility of the food safety person to communicate well. These are the risks. I'm laying them out. Here are options. This is my recommendation. Here are some other things that can be done. But if we do these other things, here's the downside to them. This is why it's not my recommendation. But in the end, it's up to company management to make a decision. And I think as long as you have presented all the information, sometimes that decision is out of your hands. Now, when it's like a critical decision, one that you strongly disagree with, then maybe you need to reconsider your career path. But I have seen the food safety people who are viewed as police, and some of them just act like, they act pretty authoritative when that's not collaborative, that's not collegial, and I don't know that it always gets you to the right food safety end.
Mm-hmm. Completely agree. I appreciate the insight because I've been in those shoes. I know exactly how that feels.
Sure. No, I like that as well, hearing that it doesn't also have to be authoritative, because I think that might actually be another way that someone would perceive going into food safety, that it's always going to be that way. It's always just, I'm telling someone, and they might not realize that it's it can be a very collaborative environment. I've spoken to Melody Gee. She worked in the food safety, and she was saying that her way of going about it, she did mention the word influence. She does not like being called the police. She's like, that is not me. We are trying to influence individuals, but we want to do it in a collaborative way. To what you were saying, there's a lot of listening involved and hearing about what someone else might think. Of course, again, black and white with certain food safety issues, but I like that you brought out that it should be more influence that we think about.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This podcast episode is sponsored by CareersNow. CareersNow is Food and Beverage Ontario's multi-year workforce development initiative that is connecting students and job seekers with employers in Ontario's food and beverage processing industry to connect you with exciting career opportunities. Check out careersnow.ca for more information on exciting jobs, career information, industry mentors, and training opportunities for professional development. Let's get back into the episode. One thing that I wanted to talk about more, because a lot of the podcasts we focus on we're food grads, but we know there's agri-food and then there's food processing. But you did a lot of work with produce, and I'd love to just explore a little bit about how is the produce side different than the food processing side? Like, what type of food safety aspects are thought about in that might be a little different to that of processed foods?
It is quite different.
Okay.
And I would say that for me, of all the sectors that I have touched, that I've worked in, produce is the hardest.
Really?
So I come, back when I was in school, and you've got my cat here she loves food safety. She just, she's a big fan. When I was in school, produce safety really wasn't a thing. It wasn't on the radar. It was ground beef and maybe chicken and eggs were kind of the issues. And so having my degree's in food science, it was more on the processed food side, the manufactured food side. And that's what you learned about, and thermal processing and everything. And then, not that those products, those categories, those processes can't have issues, they do. But when you move into produce and you see there is no kill step, it is only preventive. And you have to be perfect all the time at prevention. You don't have that kill step to lean on. Is there washing, commercial washing? Yes, it's not a kill step. In fact, done poorly, it can make things worse. It can just spread contamination around and you have more contaminated product. So produce is really, really hard. You're usually growing outside, although there is an uptick in indoor agriculture now, which is not risk-free. Sometimes some of those companies think they are. That's not quite true. The risks may be different. But certainly when you're growing outside and you are subject to the elements, you've got wildlife, other types of animals that may be kind of in your region, your neighbors or what have you, these present some hazards. And then you need to think about, does it actually present a risk? So what is that risk? How can I manage that risk? How can I avoid contamination, knowing that someone is going to eat this product, usually raw? And so I find produce to be different. Every food is different. Every process is different, but produce is really different, and it's really, really hard to manage. And I think the industry generally does a very good job, but we see in the headlines that it is not perfect and there is room for improvement.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Would you just be able to provide an example, maybe your favorite produce that you worked with, just to think about the food safety steps that are involved? Because I'm just imagining, you mentioned washing, but then I was thinking, well, what else is there that someone could do in order to minimize the risk?
Yeah, so there's not a whole lot. So you start with, well, what is the risk and where is the risk coming from? If my risk is coming from the irrigation water and I'm spraying, like overhead spraying my crops, as leafy greens had been, now they've moved to a lot of drip irrigation, some for food safety reasons, some for conservation of water. But then you said, well, maybe I could treat the water. So there would be that opportunity, the irrigation water. Wash water, yes, you can add antimicrobials to try to prevent that cross-contamination via the water. For some products, product-specific, maybe you want to keep the product very dry. Onions being a great example, they're not washed if they're not processed. They're just kind of coming out of the ground. You don't want moisture because that could allow an organism that's there to grow, to multiply. So these are the types of controls that can be implemented, but it's very much the hurdle concept, the application of multiple hurdles, little things that you can do at many points in production, many points in the supply chain that cumulatively, you hope, are enough to protect people.
Wow, that makes sense. Again, new perspectives on food, new perspectives on how I'm not as scared of getting sick as I take so much for granted, even though I do think the food safety professionals, it's amazing. Anna, did you have anything else that you wanted to ask about that?
I think there's up and coming like superfoods that a lot of people are doing, and that one of the item was sprouted grains and sprouted germs. I guess what is your perspective on that from a food safety perspective? Because there's a lot of people that really wants to have it, but knowing the controls and the bacterial kind of contamination that could occur, they may be shying away from it. But I know the media is highly promoting that as like an up and coming superfood. So I wanted to get your perspective on it.
Yeah, and I mean, there are a couple of things that I would think about. First is, are we talking sprouts like mung bean sprouts, alfalfa sprouts, or are we talking about a plant that has a leaf, even if it's a very immature leaf, kind of like the microgreens? So those are actually they're produced in very different ways, though they both look kind of fragile. The way that they're grown and therefore the risks associated with them are pretty different. So FDA has very specific rules for sprouts, like actual sprouts. They do not have they have a produce safety rule. That's for all produce. So microgreens would fall under that. So there are rules. I don't mean to imply that there are not rules. They're just different whether you're sprouting sprouts or you're planting a seed and letting it get to the earliest stage of maturity. So different regulatory requirements, different risks. I like to think that if you're aware of the risks, you can manage them. So the sprouting industry has done a lot of work on seed decontamination. It seems that a lot of the issues have been associated with the seeds themselves. So manage it on that side. If it's a listeria issue, though, then that's something that's happening in your own production environment. Your sprouting environment could happen in an indoor environment. We know that happens in packing houses, processing facilities for all types of products. Well, the way you manage that through sanitation, hygienic design is very different. So my concern, I guess, around any sort of food fad, food trend is that you have people who see a market opportunity, that they can get into this space and that they think, oh, anybody can just grow food, like it's easy. And they don't think about the food safety ramifications. So I think as a consumer, doing your due diligence that you're purchasing from a reputable company, one that is aware of the whole idea of food safety and is managing food safety, is important to protect yourself. So there's not necessarily bad, unsafe foods, but there are definitely some unsafe practices. And I think for a consumer, it's often hard to discern who's a good player, and what might I want to avoid.
Mm-hmm. But absolutely amazing. Well, maybe not amazing, but it's always good. Again, it's hard for consumers, and even sometimes I can struggle to know which companies are reputable because you can have, especially with the world, marketing and all that. It can be tough for the consumers, and thinking about taking it a step back, and taking it and thinking about the future. One of the things that I know we've spoken about the different roles that we've done, but one of the things that I was interested for the listeners is just thinking about the changing field of food safety and maybe how that might change in the future. And I wanted to know if you have any perspectives or ideas about maybe new technologies or new things that would be important for a student that's looking to grow into this field. Like, what things should be on their watch, or skills maybe that should be worked on?
A lot is changing. I mean, I mentioned when I was in school, produce safety wasn't even a thing. And so you fast forward to now and a ton has changed. And so to try to think 5 years, 10 years from now, what else is going to change? I mean, it kind of blows my mind. Another thing that didn't exist when I was a student was whole genome sequencing. And clearly that's changed our outbreak investigation processes. And now we're starting to move toward the microbiome more broadly, looking at bioinformatics as its own discipline. So starting to bridge the laboratory science with data science. I think this is an area where we'll see some explosive growth and gains in knowledge as we better understand how do these organisms work and how do they persist and what can they avoid? And from there, hopefully come up with some technologies to kill or control them, right? So like we know irradiation works. That's not new. Will there suddenly be increased consumer acceptance for irradiation? Who knows? Will there be other technologies that we have available, other processes? There's a lot of research that goes on in this space, but not a whole lot that make it to commercial application. So I am very curious to see how we start to employ the tools that we already have, but maybe use them in some different ways. With AI, I mean, that's like all the rage now, right? So
Yep.
will that what can that replace? What can that augment? And where might it cause confusion or misdirection? I do have concerns around an over-reliance or a complacency on, kind of letting a computer do things that a person needs to at least check and be like, whoa, that's just not right. But how can we look at data differently? How can we see trends in data differently to start to fine tune and find those opportunities to better manage our food safety systems? How can we look at things as bigger, broader systems rather than an individual test result, or an individual data point?
I'm really excited to see where that world is coming because, again, when I'm speaking with students, I feel they're wondering, well, what can I do in data science that's related to food? And I always do think of food safety. We think of, being able to analyze the data for something that comes off the line using IR sensors, using all those in combination. But I still feel that there's this little bit of there's a gap between the scientists coming in, you're going to the hard sciences, and then the computer sciences who have that whole programming knowledge. It's how do we bring these worlds together that both can see on both sides?
For sure. I agree.
What about you, Anna?
I think it's very interesting because I worked in the flour category before, like flours for baking, and there's technically no kill step there as well. And our company was looking into having products that's heat treated, but it never made it to commercialization just because it denatures the protein and the baking aspect is just different for the audience. So I was just thinking to what Jennifer was saying, like some things are in the research space, but it just never gets launched to market. And I guess I want to see if there's any more that can be maybe unraveled with the help of like technology and AIs, etc. Like maybe bring that into fruition maybe later on in the day because it never worked before.
Right.
That's true. And thinking about students, coming, it does, irregardless of how AI is going to affect, data is going to become, data has always been in food factories to a degree. There's always been the temperature checks that you get every day with the fridges, all these different monitoring techniques, and maybe they've been on paper, but they've never necessarily translated to the food safety field. Sorry, not the food safety, coming to the more larger scale data analysis. Do you have any recommendations for students who maybe want to, like how they can incorporate this type of thinking that there's someone who thinks about the data? Do you have any advice to really, because I do think it'd be a good way, it's a good path to understand. Do you have any advice for students to incorporate more of this data thinking or how to involve it in their studies?
Yeah, I think it's a tough question because the obvious answer is like, oh, well, find a class because it's an emerging field. There are classes now on data science or, you can go into some depth. But the problem that I see is food science and even food safety is already so big and broad and reliant on the foundational sciences that like, where are you going to, as a student, where are you going to have room in your schedule to fit this in? So if you fit this in, what are you swapping out? It becomes a trade-off, right? Like if we could all just take 37 credits a semester, sure, that would be great. But like, no one is going to do that. So then what are other ways that we can learn? So there's the traditional taking a course, which would be great, would be ideal. if you can fit it into your schedule. But what if you can't? If you can't, maybe you have a friend who takes the class and you can just kind of chat about the concepts or, start reading some articles. I encourage people to be more, I hate to say worldly, but sometimes you can be inspired or you can have ideas reading about things that have nothing to do with food, nothing to do with food safety. Just start to see how are some of these tools being applied to other industries or other problems. And that curiosity and that creativity go hand in hand. And people who are self-motivated and who are lifelong learners, think you can start to pick some things up yourself. Maybe you listen to some podcasts on the topic. Maybe you take some online classes kind of at your leisure. So I think with the communication tools and the education tools that we have today, there are multiple ways that people can start to fold these concepts into their own thinking and their own toolbox. You may not be an expert. If you're not going to take real solid coursework, you're probably not going to become like the world's expert on this topic. But maybe by doing a little bit of reading, you realize, I do want to be the world's expert. I'm going to shift gears. I'm going to change my major or what have you. But it starts with that awareness and curiosity and just being open to new things and new ideas. But as a scientist working in food, to not have that recognition of how this data science world is going to intersect with yours, I think one would be pretty naive to think that they can remain siloed and just ignore the world of data science.
Mm-hmm. It almost sounds, well, the way you're saying is don't forget your foundations. It's good to have the data awareness, but you can't get out of your foundations. How does this work? Science.
I am very thankful that I have the foundations that I have, and I think it's tempting to want to skip ahead, to skip to the electives, but you really do need that foundation and those prerequisites.
Either soft skills or hard skills, I guess, from technical skills. What other soft skills would you say you would recommend a student to have to go into food safety?
So I think there's a lot of talk about soft skills, and I still don't see a whole lot of effort put into developing those soft skills. Yeah, maybe in a class you have to give like a presentation or you have a group project and you need to learn teamwork, but that's not really refining someone's skills and not pushing people to improve on those soft skills. So the world of soft skills is broad, and I think everyone needs to think about their own comfort level, their own personality, their own style that they want to cultivate and refine and adapt. For me, I started realizing that there were certain people that I would interact with who just caught my attention. I would listen to them and I was mesmerized by them. And then I realized it kind of didn't matter what they were saying. And they just had this ability to motivate people or to bring people together. And I started to really dissect, how do they do this? What is their magic? And through that, also thought about, what can I fold into myself? How can I emulate some of these things that they do? On the other hand, I also found people who maybe were technical experts, super, super smart, really deep in knowledge, and just not very effective. And also trying to figure out, why are they not effective? They are like the world's expert in this topic. Why is this happening? And how can I avoid that? So I think that some of the soft skill refinement is by seeing what works in other people and trying to adapt that and trying to create situations for yourself where you have the opportunity to practice, maybe in some safe spaces, like, co-hosting a podcast, for example.
Perfect segue. I will say, I'll self-proclaim the podcast. I have noticed the way that I speak has changed, and I'm more cognizant of how I ask questions. Still improving. But with that being said, another question. You did say take it outside of school, try to find opportunities. Did you have any podcasts or, okay, I actually have two questions the way I'm doing it, but did you actively did you go to a course? I know that you said you really watched how people spoke. Was it very self-learning, or did you go out and maybe do a course on that or do something alternative?
Really self-learning.
Okay.
The formal learning opportunities, especially when I was earlier in my career, were kind of limited. Like you had to fly to a meeting if you wanted to talk. There was no like Zoom or anything like that. Which I just said, which I hate. And I try to be so aware of saying, but these are the things that, yes, when you do speak a lot and you listen to yourself, which a lot of people hate doing, but now that we have the opportunity to record things on video, you can watch yourself. You learn a lot by watching yourself. So that's another way that I learned. I mentioned earlier that I'm a native Long Islander, which most people are surprised by. And they say, you don't sound like you're from Long Island. And they'll go, Long Island. Yes, because I worked hard at that. It was a conscious effort that I made. So it wasn't formal coursework, but it was heightened self-awareness, and it was being made fun of and being kind of sensitive to being made fun of for certain things, that you develop new habits and new routines and practice and keep trying to do better.
I think that's a good tip. I heard recently to what you were saying, don't say the word if you're thinking, just don't speak.
Pause.
Pause, just don't speak, just think. And it also gives you an opportunity to slow down and realize, am I saying something that's really necessary?
Right.
Well, with that also being said, and we have to be cognizant of time and such, I will let, as I say, I will let Anna take it away with the last question. If there's anything else you'd like to add before we have to let Jennifer go.
I wanted to ask if there's any membership or forums that you feel like students should be, working towards to connecting so that they get more information in food safety and just overall networking, because school is just school, but what other, I guess, additional third-party forums or something like that you can think of that would be great for students to connect to?
For sure. Being involved, having the opportunity to ask people who are professionals about their career paths, listening to people, observing their styles is so critically important. And so I mentioned earlier in my career, IFT was what I gravitated toward. At the time, IAFP didn't have a student association. Now they do, a pretty active one, I think, too. And so to me, IAFP is kind of the home for food safety professionals. I think it's a good size where you still have a diversity of people who are there, but it's not quite as intimidating as going to the IFT show with tens of thousands of people. You have a few thousand people, most of whom kind of know each other or somehow networked with each other. And so it becomes little easier if you're shy or a little apprehensive to start to fold into the mix there. From a technical side, they do a great job on food safety, but I think from the networking and social side, it's also a great home for students to begin to expand their network and learn and meet people. To me, it's always so interesting when you talk to people.
Amazing. I love it. I'll make sure to share that in the show notes so those that are listening can find it a little bit easier. And we'll finish it off with the last question, Jennifer. Where can people find you?
The easiest place to find me is probably on LinkedIn. So I try to remain kind of active. I do have a website for my company, foodsafetystrategy.com, and my blog posts are there, but then I push them out via LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is really the easiest place. I'm not a big Twitter person. I don't know. It's just not my.
I don't think anyone is anymore. I don't think anyone is. Well, I'll leave it at that. And thank you once more, Jennifer, for taking time to come on the show. And of course, my lovely co-host today, Anna, for asking
Thank
some
you.
questions that I would have never thought of. So thank you so much, Jennifer. And I can't wait to share this episode with others.
It's been super fun. Thanks so much.
I know that this podcast episode was a little different having Anna Koo on the show, but I think that it's fun to have a co-host to bring in some fresh perspectives once in a while. What I liked most about this episode with Jennifer is that although there is a lot of black and white when it comes to the field of food safety, there's also a lot of gray too, and that comes in the form of risk management. And being able to communicate these risks in itself is a skill too. You don't need to work in a food manufacturing facility. You can even work in the government, which is pretty cool. If you want to learn more about Jennifer or find out any of the resources that were mentioned in the show, then check out the show notes to this podcast episode. So thank you, Jennifer, for coming on the show, Anna for co-hosting, and thank you everyone so much for listening. I'll see you next time.